All right, this time we'll have staff presentations. Dave with Antlerless deer and elk license allocations.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm David Stainbrook. I'm the Deer and Elk Section Supervisor with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. And today I'll be covering 4 items related to deer and elk management. Our first item will be elk license allocation recommendations. Second will be a request to propose a change to the Deer Management Assistance Program to include leased lands. Third is simply a review of the proposal to change the Agricultural Deer Control Program, or our red tag program. This was given preliminary approval in the July meeting, so this is just simply a review of that. And then finally, I'll cover the antlerless deer allocations at the end. So for our first item is our staff recommendations for our elk licenses for the 2022-2023 seasons. For antlerless, for archery antlerless, there are no changes. For the general antlerless, we have a change of reducing it by 7 in zone 2. And then for the late season antlerless, a reduction of 6 in zone 2 as well, for a total of 13. On the antlered side, no change for antlered archery. We are reducing 1 bull tag in zone 5 for the general antlered, and increasing by 5 in the late season for antlered across several zones. So this is a net decrease of 9 overall. To put in perspective, we are proposing 118 antlerless licenses or tags and 60 bull tags for a total of 178, which is slightly lower than last year, higher than the year before. The rationale for this is for the antlerless changes are motivated by a reduction in harvest success rates, particularly for that hunt zone 2, combined with the overall goal of maintaining a stable population. And for the antlered side, the slight increase, in order to increase our hunting opportunity, we can allow that, and also to maintain that post-harvest bull to cow ratio. We're looking for 25 bulls to 100 cows, so we can accommodate this increase in bull tags. The second item is a request to allow leased lands to be eligible for Deer Management Assistance Program, or DMAP. The role of the Deer Management Assistance Program, or DMAP, is to provide additional opportunity and means for landowners to manage deer to meet their land use goals outside of the regular unit level antlerless allocations. And the historic restrictions that the Game Commission has used on these permits for leased lands to encourage public access didn't really lead to significantly more public access or prevention of leased lands. Leased lands still exist, and they are a small part of the PA landscape. From our hunter surveys, we found that approximately 5% of hunters reported paying for hunting access in Pennsylvania. And we've started these surveys since 2011, and it's been pretty stable of those responses since then. Finally, DMAP is already allowed on private lands that restrict hunting access. And that's because it's an important tool to manage local landowner issues when management unit level antlerless licenses are limited in that area. Our third item is, again, a review of the proposed changes to the Agricultural Deer Control Program. These, again, were given preliminary approval at the July meeting, and I'm not going to go through all the changes, but I'll highlight some of the major ones. So the Agricultural Deer Control Program is a program that authorizes a farmer to enlist in the aid of a limited number of hunters for the purpose of removing only antlerless deer from the farmer's property, and this is outside of the deer season. The program was commonly known as the red tag program because of these red plastic snap tags that were distributed from our region offices to the farmers. The farmers then have to take those tags, distribute them to the hunters that they allow on their property, 1 per hunter. So each hunter was limited to 1 antlerless deer. That farmer was then responsible for making a written report every month for all of the harvest and non-harvest for those snap tags, and at the end of the season, returning those red tags back to the Game Commission. What we're proposing is that we move from these red plastic tags to our typical coupon permit process, just like with DMAP. We already had the system in place to accommodate it. And we would also proposing that this would, similar to DMAP, allow the hunters that they allow on their land to be able to harvest up to 4 deer through this process. Another change would be to put the permit start and end date, not the allowable times they can hunt, but the actual permit associated with that to be consistent with other permits to start July 1st to June 30th. So this would bring it in line with the other permits that we process. And we're also looking to do an online renewal process for these applicants just to streamline this. We've already created this for DMAP. It's live this year. The framework's already been built to accommodate the red tag program into this. And then finally, we did reduce the valid dates that hunters could use for this program. To put this in perspective, there is another program with there's a state law, Title 34, which allows farmers to shoot any deer at any time, any day of the year, causing damage. That's Chapter 21, Section 2121. What this program with red tag is different. This is what we currently have for our season. It runs from February 1st to May 16th. It's closed throughout the summer, starts again July 1st through September 28th. What we're proposing is just the similar time frame. Because we're starting with the July 1st start of our permit, that would make it so the season would start August 1st through September 15th, and then again February 1st through April 15th. And some of the reasons which I covered before, the main reasons is that we are restricting some of the time allowed in that summer period, which is also kind of maintaining the time frame when most of the deer are taken with this program anyways, but it helps limit the issues that we run into with fawning season. And we also cut off the end of after September 15th so that we don't overlap with our archery and the special regulations areas. The other point I want to make here is farmers can still rely on hunters during the regular deer seasons. They can still rely on DMAP, and they also have the ability to take deer under Chapter 21, Section 2121. And finally, the deer management program and our allocation. So I'm going to give a brief overview of how we come to these antlerless allocations and the deer management program, and then at the end I'll cover our recommendations for antlerless allocations. Things I wanted to highlight: our program is a very transparent program. We put all of our information that goes into this process on our website, including the deer management plan, our estimates for our harvest for the past season, and then shortly after this meeting, we'll post the population report with all the data that goes into the antlerless allocation recommendations. So the Game Commission has publicly identified and supported deer management goals. They guide us in making our antlerless license allocation recommendations. These include a healthy and sustainable deer population, acceptable levels of deer-human conflicts, a healthy and sustainable forest habitat, to provide recreational opportunity, and to improve information and education. These goals are supported both by Pennsylvania hunters and the broader public in Pennsylvania, as you can see on the figure on the right. These all revolve around our mission statement as the agency. These goals have different measures, so I'll highlight each one of those. So for our first goal, for the goal of managing deer for a sustainable population, we look at fawn to doe ratios from our harvest data, we look at population trends, and we look for the presence of chronic wasting disease in our free-ranging deer. And we do this within each one of our wildlife management units. For the goal of managing for sustainable forests, we look at data on forest regeneration and deer forest impacts, and these are collected by the U.S. Forest Service. And for the goal of acceptable deer-human conflicts, we use a survey data collected by a third-party survey company that asks the public if deer numbers where they live are too low, just right, or too high. In all, we look over 750,000 data points and work through a process, defined decision process to determine if goals are being met and determine if the deer population objective should be to increase, decrease, or stabilize deer populations in each management unit. So along this defined process, I've covered the deer management goals. These were for the healthy deer herd, forest habitat, and acceptable deer-human conflicts. We have our objective based on the data to increase, decrease, or stabilize the population trends. Then we once we determine the objectives, we then determine the number of antlerless deer that need to be harvested to meet those objectives. And we focus on the antlerless harvest, specifically the females, because that's the reproductive portion of the population. And then finally, we determine how many licenses we need to allocate to achieve those antlerless harvest objectives to meet our population objectives. And we look at past success rates in harvest to come up with those recommendations. So I'm going to go through some of the data that we use now. So for the population trends, we look at trends over the past 6 years. And deer populations are stable in nearly all of the management units in the state right now. We also look at the fawn to doe ratio, and we do see that it's decreasing in 3 of those units, but the population trend is still stable. And then for B is the one that we do see a decreasing population trend, but that is by design because the objective was to reduce deer numbers because of chronic wasting disease in that unit. We also look at chronic wasting disease. We're focused on if it's detected in the wild population within a unit. And if it is, then the objective is to reduce deer numbers in that area. And keep in mind, because we're looking at 6 years of data for our trends, we expect that the other CWD units will start to show that decreasing trend in the future. The next is forest regeneration and deer impacts. Again, this is collected by the U.S. Forest Service. In general, most of our units are considered fair for regeneration on the left, the light green, and acceptable levels of forest impacts on the figure on the right, again in light green. For the left, regeneration is considered good when over 70% of the plots have adequate regeneration, and this is occurring in 4 of our units: 1A, 2F, 3B, and 4A. Those are the ones in dark green on the left. In Unit 2A, which is the red WMU on the left, forest regeneration was considered poor. This is when less than 50% of the plots have adequate regeneration, and then the remaining units were considered fair. In our urbanized special regulation area units, we do not have sufficient data from the Forest Service to come up with these measures. So deer forest impacts were considered acceptable. This is moderate impacts are or below 3, and this is on a 1 to 5 scale. That was in all of the units except 3D and 4E, where deer impacts are considered too high. These are the units on red on the right. Although 2A on the left had poor regeneration and is red, the deer impacts were not considered too high. So poor regeneration can be driven by other factors besides deer, so we will continue to monitor the deer impacts and regeneration in that unit in future years. For the goal of acceptable deer-human conflicts, we rely on data collected from PA residents by a third-party survey company, Responsive Management. Through these surveys, we found that most residents surveyed said the population is just right where they live. Those values range from 45 to 57%. So essentially, our map is light green across all of these units based on the public survey. And I'm going to walk you through our flow chart that comes to our population objective, kind of using each one of these data sets that we rely on. So our first one, whether people want more or less deer, again, because our survey suggests that most residents say the population is just right, we will not take that yes option. Everything goes down to no. If CWD is present, all of those units where we have detected it in our wild population have that objective to reduce the population. So this includes all of those units in pink. For those that do not have CWD, we then look at fawn to doe ratio, if it's decreasing, and if the population trends below our objective. All of the remaining units are a no there. So we continue to forest habitat, the regeneration measure. Again, for units 2B, 5C, and 5D, we do not have sufficient data look at this. So we have to bypass that and go directly to, do people want more or less deer? Again, everybody is satisfied with the level of deer, so we get to a stabilize for our population objective for those units. Because 2 of those units were already in CWD, those drop out. And then we continue looking at other measures of forest impacts and changes over time till we get to the deer forest impacts measure, where the 2 units that had higher impacts end up having an objective to reduce, and then the rest have a stabilize. So this is just kind of this defined process that we go through with all the units and all of the data that we collect to come to the conclusion of what is our objective, whether to stabilize the deer population in this unit, to increase it, or to reduce it. So once all of that has been done, this is when we come to our overall assessment of objectives, and that includes to stabilize the deer population in all units, with the exception of the ones that have CWD in the wild population and the ones that had forest impacts. And then finally, this is our last step of determining the allocations. And again, this is where we look at the objective, we look at prior harvest data and success rates. And I do want to point out that we did have the change last year where we moved all of our units to statewide concurrent, and we did adjust our allocations accordingly so that we, would account for the additional days in the harvest. In all of our units where we had an objective to stabilize, we were able to prevent the antlerless harvest from going up just like we wanted. So you can see here that in all of the units in red are the ones that have the objective to reduce the deer population. And all of the ones that are not in red have an objective to stabilize. So we are recommending to keep the allocations the same as last year in those units where CWD has been present for several years. This includes 2C, 2D, 2E, 4A, 4B, 4D, 4E, and 5A. We've already increased the allocation and target antlerless harvest for multiple years in a row in an effort to reduce the deer population in these units. We'd like to keep the allocation stable to increase our ability to identify changes in the population via our harvest indices. In other words, we believe the CWD units that we've had the allocations at a level that will cause a population reduction. We don't need to turn that knob further this year. However, we will monitor the population trends in the future and make recommendations to adjust them accordingly. The one CWD unit that is different would be 2F. This is one that we just detected CWD in last year. So the recommendation here is to increase the allocation to decrease the deer population. This would be the first time that that measure is taken for CWD. And for unit 3D, this is the unit that continues to show forest impacts from deer. So our recommendation is to increase the allocation to decrease the deer population. The rest of the management units have a recommended allocation to stabilize the population. And that concludes the recommendations from our staff for deer allocation. So I can take any questions at this time on any of the topics I covered. Be happy to go back. Thank you.
I have one. I've been hearing from a number of foresters that deer browse impacts are getting more significant in many areas of the state. Do you foresee the deer impact surveys changing in the future, or where are you at on that?
So we have relied on the U.S. Forest Service data, their forest and inventory analysis, their FIA data for a lot of our measures, but we are also looking into improving those measures. We have the Deer Forest Study Initiative, which is a research project with Penn State, DCNR, and USGS to look at ways that we can improve those measures. Are there ways that we can detect that sooner? Are there ways that we can use the FIA data in a different way to detect certain things that may not show the way that we do it currently? So that is one of the projects we're working on. And we realize that with the federal data collection, with budget issues and everything, it's not being collected as frequently or as often as we would like it to be. So it's a challenge, and we're trying to address that through some of the research that we're doing.
And the Forest Service conducts those statewide, right? Even
Correct.
though we only
They-
have one national forest here in Pennsylvania.
Correct. They collected on private and public land on these plots throughout the state of Pennsylvania, but also in other states throughout the country. They do collect additional data for us to come up with the forest impact measure. They don't do that in every state in the country. They do it here. And that's one of the measures that we really rely on for that. That information is very critical for this whole process.
Thank you.
But yeah, they have enough plots that we can look at unit by unit, and it's representative across all land types, not just public lands.
Right. Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nate, 22, 23 migratory game birds.
Yeah, directors, council, members of the commission. I'm Nate Huck. I'm the waterfowl program specialist, and I'm going to be covering our migratory game bird seasons as well as providing some research updates on some projects I have going on throughout the state. So first and foremost, I'd like to point out that migratory bird season setting occurs outside of the board's formal approval process. And the reason for this is migratory birds are ultimately under federal authority, and this is through the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. States like Pennsylvania can provide input in that process, working together with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, other states, and the Canadian Wildlife Service through the Atlantic Flyway Council process. There's 4 flyway councils across the country. And through that input process, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service then establishes season frameworks. So these frameworks are kind of the outside sideboards that we can set our migratory game bird seasons within. These include things like season length, bag limits for each species, the earliest opening and the latest closing dates, the total number of season segments, and the number of splits that we can have in those seasons. So outside of that federal process, we have a state level process that we use to set our seasons. And this state level process begins with a comprehensive waterfowl survey. The most recent survey was conducted in 2020. During that survey, we asked hunters for various season preferences. Generally speaking, within those federal frameworks, we feel we don't negatively impact populations, and therefore we kind of are more interested in what hunters would like to see from the seasons when we set them. So we use that information from those preference surveys to develop season proposals. We then provide those season proposals to the public, and we seek public comment through the Waterfowl Comments email. And this year we received 99 comments through that email. While that public comment process is open, we had a Facebook Live, myself and Ian did, where we address frequently brought up issues, frequent questions, frequent requests. We also had a public meeting at Middle Creek, and that Facebook Live actually received over 12,000 views. And so after that whole public comment period is done, we draft up kind of a more formal season proposals. So those season proposals were recently shared with all of senior staff and the board, looking for kind of a final round of comment. And then we'll draft a finalized season proposal that Brian ultimately signs and is then provided to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and is ultimately published in the Federal Register. So kind of jumping back a little bit, generally speaking, those federal frameworks don't vary much from year to year. However, on occasion, we do see some changes. This year, there were 2 federal framework changes that impact how we set seasons here within Pennsylvania. The first being the Southern James Bay population zone was eliminated. So this is our new goose zone map. Historically, we had a zone carved out in the northwest part of the state, including portions of western Crawford County and Erie County. And that was to focus management on the Southern James Bay population geese. That population nests along Southern James Bay and wintered primarily historically in northwest Pennsylvania. That population over the last 50 years has started to shift west and now primarily winters in Michigan and Ohio. And so since we don't have that migratory population, it's no longer necessary for us to specifically manage for them. About 2 years ago, we saw this writing on the wall and we shifted the season in that area to more mirror what that season will look like in the resident population zone that we currently have. And we've received really no negative public comment on that season shift. And so this year we've eliminated that SJBP zone, and that will be part of the resident population zone. But like I said, we don't kind of really expect the public to be too upset about that. The other framework change we saw is related to the hooded merganser restricted bag limit. This hooded mergansers have generally been doing pretty well the last few decades. They've generally increased in population, and because of that and their relatively low harvest across the flyway, the Atlantic Flyway Council asked the Fish and Wildlife Service to remove that restricted bag limit. Historically, merganser bag limit is 5, of which no more than 2 could be hooded mergansers. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agreed with that request, and so this year, for example, you could harvest 3 hooded mergansers, 4 hooded mergansers, or 5 as part of that 5 hooded merganser bag limit. I want to kind of jump in. For 2 of the populations, we generally received a lot of negative feedback about bag limits. And so first and foremost, our mallard population. Some of you have probably seen this graph before. This is the general trends of the mallard population. That top line is the overall population. That orange line is the Northeast US population. Mallards over the last 2 decades in the Northeast US have declined about 36%, which has really driven that overall population decline, whereas Eastern Canada has remained relatively stable through that time frame. And Pennsylvania breeding population has actually declined about 50% during that same time frame. And in 2019, we did a potential take analysis, which basically says, where should we set these bag limits so that we don't negatively impact the population further? And the recommendation that came out of that was a 2-bird bag limit with a 1-hen restriction. I'll note we do have a new population model that we're currently working on that next year when I'm here during our proposed seasons, we'll probably have we should hopefully have in place, which may currently the early signs are that things look maybe a little better than we thought they did, but I'll have more for that in the future. Jumping to the other one, and this is pretty much our most controversial issue in waterfowl management right now. That Atlantic population zone down in the southeast part of the state, during the regular season, we are limited to a 1-bird daily bag limit. So that's a 30-day season with a 1-bird daily bag limit. Many of our constituents aren't very happy with that, and understandably so. However, this is really necessary. That population nests in northern Quebec, and for the last decade or so, they've seen reduced reproductive success, including in 2018 where they had a complete reproductive failure. The birds basically went up there, temperatures were still in the freezing conditions, and they were unable to successfully nest. And so that really drove that population down a lot faster than we've really seen before. And as a result, we moved to a 2-bird bag limit in 2019 and again in 2020, but we didn't see the harvest reductions that we really wanted to see as a result. And so in 2021 and 22, we had a 1-bird daily bag limit, and we will have that again in 2022 and 23. This is one of those federal frameworks that we can't change. I will note, we haven't actually been able to monitor this population for the last 2 years because of COVID. A lot of those communities where these populations breed have been completely closed. It looks like we're going to be able to get back up on the breeding grounds again this year and start monitoring that population and doing banding again. And so hopefully that population has rebounded in the last 2 years, and we'll be able to see that next year. In terms of proposed duck season dates, I have really our proposed duck season and goose season dates reflect a no change proposal. We made a pretty significant, two significant changes to the duck season in 2021-22. The first being mostly a statewide opener where you can see northwest, north, and south zones all open on the same day. This was as a result of those northern zones where historically they opened before the south zone. Talking about hunter crowding on opening day, a lot of people from the south moving north. And so we accommodated that request, and generally speaking, appears to be a relatively positive response. The other thing that we did was shift the south zone season a week later. Again, relatively well received. I will note that generally speaking, public comment has asked for later seasons for duck season. I don't think this should come as any surprise given the really warm winter we had last year. You know, a lot of people didn't see those winter conditions that they wanted to see. However, if we'd have gone 2 years ago, you know, we were frozen across most of the state by the first week of January. So we generally don't chase weather like that. And so, and those comments do reflect a really small proportion of our 30 to 35,000 waterfowl hunters. Again, as I mentioned, here's our proposed goose season dates. This also reflects no change. Last year, we did make 2 changes. We shifted that second or third portion of the resident population a week later. And the Atlantic, we also shifted a week later, really just to kind of line those in the resident population to give some more February opportunity, and the Atlantic population to line that season up with duck season dates. Both of these were pretty well received. And again, other than the removal of that southern James Bay zone, this represents no change. From there, I'm going to jump over into our kind of some research updates, some of the interesting things I'm working on right now. The first being the resident population goose study. This study is in cooperation with Penn State, Karen Beatty, and Franny Buterman. And we're marking birds at both Pymatuning and Middle Creek and trying to really understand how hunting impacts habitat usage throughout through both of these areas. Kind of one early thing that we've seen that's really interesting. At Middle Creek, you can see on the right, that green is the non-hunting season, and the yellow is the hunting season. We saw about a 50% reduction in the total habitat usage during hunting season. However, in kind of the opposite over at Pymatuning, we actually saw birds using more, increase their home range usage by 2 times. Basically, it was double the size. And really, this is in relation to where hunting is allowed on the units and where those refuge areas are. So the birds had to travel farther to avoid hunters. So it kind of seems counterintuitive, but it's just basically how those 2 units are laid out. One interesting thing on the right, that is a movement of a bird that was marked at Pymatuning. Last year, that bird spent all winter in and around Greenville. Last June, it left and migrated all the way to the north. You can see all the way up there in northern Quebec. So that is actually the breeding area of those AP Canada geese I talked about earlier. The bird then migrated back south, spent all winter in Ohio, and 3 weeks ago is now back on the very same pond that it spent last winter on. Another project is the Mallard project. So kicked off this year, and we are marking over 1,000 female mallards with these backpack style transmitters that you can see on the right. And we're getting 1-hour locations from these birds for the next, hopefully, well over a year. And on the left, you can see the movement of the birds just marked in Pennsylvania. This represents 43 birds. There's been a lot of movement here in the last few weeks, and even in the last week when there was only 1 bird. there was only 1 bird in Canada and 3 birds in New York. Now currently there's 7 birds in Canada and another 3 birds in New York. So this study is really aiming to get at some of those mallard decline questions that we have. What is annual survival? What does nest success look like? And really we hope to be able to use the results of that to improve our mallard management, both in Pennsylvania and across the flyway. A project like that takes a lot of effort. And I just want to mention some of these people really, really quickly. You know, I'm one of the project leads along with Josh Stiller at New York DEC. And then as well as Jake Straub at SUNY Brockport, Mitch Wiegman at University of Saskatchewan, Marie Rasiopa is a PhD student, and John Calusi at Ducks Unlimited. And you can see the list of all the other partners. All of those states are marking birds and assisting with purchasing transmitters and things like that. We've marked over 300 birds in 15 states and 3 Canadian provinces just this year alone. And the last project, kind of using the same collars that we used in that RP Goose project, you can see there on the right. We're hoping, as I said, we're going to get back onto the breeding grounds for AP Canada geese, and we're going to be marking birds with those collars to try and target this declining population and start to better understand where these birds are on the landscape and when they're on the landscape, so that we can hopefully really target some additional resident Canada goose hunting opportunity when these AP birds that are really vulnerable to harvest aren't on the landscape. And that project is, again, working with Josh Stiller and Bill Harvey at Maryland DNR, and then Chris Williams at University of Delaware. And we'll be marking over 450 birds over the next 3 years to get an idea of how these birds are moving across the landscape. And with that, I can take any questions on anything I've talked about.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any idea why these flyways shift, like that southern James Bay flyway shifted west? Is there any rhyme or reason to why they would shift that like that?
I don't think we have a good handle on why birds, especially like that, would shift to a winter site fidelity. You know, that's one of the things that we'll be looking at a little bit with that AP Goose project. You know, we've kind of seen those birds wintering further and further north. I think it's just, taking advantage of different landscape changes.
Is it typical of Mississippi flyway and Pacific flyway? Do they shift?
Yeah, we do see shifts in pretty much all the flyways, particularly with Canada geese. Generally speaking, it's more northerly shifts rather than westerly shifts. I don't know if you think about where that snowpack is in the winter, it kind of makes sense to shift over into Ohio, where there's a little bit less snow than Northwest Pennsylvania.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? No, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Well, that's it for today. And we'll start tomorrow morning at 8:30.